our socioeconomic planning. That ethos of making sure that we can forward plan and use as many tools as we can in our arsenal in order to be able then to address this unpredictable environment. Mr. President, in 2004, Hurricane Ivan impacted Grenada as a Category 3 hurricane, Mr. President. That damage to Grenada equated to $1.1 billion in damage and 200% of its GDP. In today's world, that would be 1.7 billion. Mr. President, it displaced 18,000 households, damaged 30% of its housing stock, and only 2 of the 75 schools on the island remained intact after the passage of that hurricane. That happened, Mr. President, in September of 2004. And while there was humanitarian aid flowing into Grenada at that time, and development partners were on the ground doing assessments, it was in mid-October that they were convening board meetings to decide what was the level of loan, not grant, loan they would give to help Grenada. So a country in complete devastation, but having to wait until development partners decided how they will treat to almost a month after that big impact. Mr. President, in 2017, Dominica experienced the impact of Hurricane Maria, a Category 5 hurricane, Mr. President. And that damaged 95% of Dominica's housing stock and had a 226% impact on its GDP, 226%, with a reported 3,059 fatalities, Mr. President. In 2019, Hurricane Dorian hit Bahamas for 2 days, Mr. President. Left 74 dead, Mr. President. And the Inter-American Development Bank said that Dorian caused about $3.4 billion in damages, which was equal to 1/4 of Bahamas' GDP. Mr. President, we also as well experienced Hurricane Maria in 2017. It passed us as a tropical storm. It drenched the island to the extent, Mr. President, that we were given a payment from the insurance facility that we'll speak to a little bit more later of just $1.2 million, again, because of the extent of the damage. And so again, Mr. President, the question that we have to ask ourselves, the question that government has to ask itself, is how do we plan? How do we make sure that we have the resources at our hand, at the ready, in order to address the critical concerns of our citizens? How do we ensure that we don't have to wait a month after till somebody is meeting within a boardroom to decide how much money they will lend us on their terms? Because of course, when you are in a crisis, then you are forced then to accept terms that might not be so favorable because of the context that you are in. So, Mr. President, what does a country do? What does a government do? The Inter-American Development Bank, in a paper of this year, January 2024, indicated that a hurricane event in the Caribbean, in the region, has the impact of a 10% increase in public debt. Often, Mr. President, new debt, because again, countries are in the position that they have existing debt, but because of the damage, because of what they have to face, then they have to go out then and get new debt in order to address the situation. And that leads, Mr. President, as the Inter-American Development Bank indicates, to a 10% increase in public debt. And then 3 years, Mr. President, after the event, public debt increases further to 18%, Mr. President. So we have a situation in which, for many of us, faced with the onslaught of climate change as experienced through natural disasters, that it also as well means debt distress. So a Barbados Labour Party government coming into power with a country already, Mr. President, in severe debt distress. When we became the government, Mr. President, this country was in debt of over $17.5 billion, Mr. President. $17.5 billion, Mr. President, or 176% of our GDP. That is the situation that this government found itself in 2018. We had that to face, but multiple downgrades as well, Mr. President, eroded investor confidence, meaning that there was very little room for the government to be able to navigate and to be able to address the circumstances that was impacting us. So this government that came in 2018 and facing these circumstances had to make some drastic decisions about how it would reposition the trajectory of the country, of this country, that was brought to its knees, Mr. President, by a previous administration that had shown themselves a failure, Mr. President, an administration that lacked vision, Mr. President, an administration without the intestinal fortitude, Mr. President, to govern, an administration that treated this society callously, Mr. President, that did not respond to the sewage that was flowing in the streets, Mr. President, or the garbage that was uncollected for months, Mr. President. That was the situation that this government of 2018 came and found itself. And because of that, the cabinet had to form itself into a war cabinet and to effectively mount a rescue mission, Mr. President, for this country, and take on mission critical. And in so doing, we had to gird our loins, Mr. President, and under the leadership of our Prime Minister, do what the previous administration could not do and demonstrate the vision and the intestinal fortitude for leadership in order to rescue this country. And we did so successfully, Mr. President. And we did so successfully in the face of the criticisms of those who, when they were in power, did not have one idea, but all of a sudden, had all the ideas and would suggest that the action that the government that was taking in order to right-size a country that was destroyed and on its knees would not work. And we have shown, Mr. President, that indeed that right-sizing was successful. So we had that circumstance to face, but we also as well learned, Mr. President, from all of the things that I spoke about before, all of the hurricanes and the natural disasters that happened, like I said, in Grenada, in Bahamas, and in Dominica. And like I said, our own experience as well in 2017 with Maria. And let's not forget that we also as well had Kurt in, I think it was September of 2018 as well. And the damage with Kurt, Mr. President, that we had an estimated rainfall in some parts of Barbados of almost 9.5 inches, to the extent, again, that under the insurance facility, we were able to get a payout of some $5.8 million US. And that just showed the extent of the damage. So that with all of that context, the government then, in October of 2018, passed legislation to include for those creditors, both locally and internationally, to include natural disaster clauses within the new instruments. And we did so, Mr. President, within the context that I had explained. One, as well, a government needing to ensure that it had sufficient wiggle room and space, Mr. President, and also, as well, one that had learned from what other countries had gone through, what we had gone through, and creating an innovative instrument to provide an option should it need in order to be able to have the necessary wiggle room. And Mr. President, we know this even in our individual lives. If something happens, all of us, whether we're paying a mortgage or we're paying rent or something happens, what do? We go to the bank, we go to the person that we have to negotiate with and we beg for a little blight. They say, give me a little breather. Let me negotiate. You know, I can't pay you right now, but give me a little too much, let me get back on my feet. So that essentially, the natural disaster clauses was governments saying to our creditors, we need a little breather. We need a little wiggle room. We need a little space in order then to be able to address the critical needs. And this is important, Mr. President, because again, oftentimes we see these things as highfalutin. We see these things as the government, again, either increasing debt, but it has real impact, Mr. President, on our daily lives. Because what happens when we don't have that space, when we don't have that option, Mr. President, of that wiggle room? When a natural disaster strikes, again, the question, will we find ourselves at the hands of having to wait on multilateral development banks to come in and assess? Well, our schools are broken, Mr. President. Well, our main hospital, Mr. President, could potentially be underwater, Mr. President. Do we want a government that has to go out begging, that has to go out waiting, or do we want a government? Do we want a government, Mr. President, that has a plan in place and that is able to address those immediate concerns? And this, Mr. President, this is exactly what we are intended to do with these natural disaster and then also as well pandemic clauses. What the clause does, Mr. President, is that they give us the option, and I want to say option, Mr. President, very clearly, because again, when you look at the consequential amendments, it is an option. Government may take up that option if it so needs to. There's nothing here that says that in every instance that the government will put these in place. It provides an option. As a homeowner, when a storm is coming, when a hurricane is coming, I do multiple things in order to ensure my safety. I don't do one. I bar the windows, I make sure I got hurricane straps, or go out and I buy some food. You do multiple things in order to ensure your safety and that of your household. So this is an option in the arsenal of government, should it need to, in order then to be able to address that situation, and when we need quick liquidity to be able to deal with the needs of our citizens. So that these clauses, Mr. President, they give us the option of asking for up to a 2-year deferral or a stop payment. In some places, these are known as debt pause clauses. For that, debt pause clauses. So deferral of up to 2 years or stop payments on the principal and the interest on the debt. Again, so the country can use the resources to address the critical needs of the country that we would, Mr. President, not have been able to do because we would have been spending those resources on paying debt. And what it does, Mr. President, is also give us the option of not necessarily having to go out and acquire new debt, Mr. President, because then we can then use existing debt. It also suggests, Mr. President, again, and because it's an option, it is an option, that of course, if you are able to get a loan that offers a better return than us having to then use the deferral, then we can do so. It is an option, Mr. President. And so we have this 2 years in the deferral of the payments of the principal and the interest on the debt, Mr. President. And what it also means then is that those payments are tacked on the end. So immediately after the 2 years, we are not then forced to then pay back all of that immediately after the deferral of the loan. Of course, it depends on the terms and the conditions of the loan as well. Mr. President, what this also means, however, is that the interest is capitalized. The interest is capitalized. And what capitalization means, Mr. President, is that in addition to the unpaid interest is added then to the outstanding principal balance, Mr. President, as well. So yes, effectively, we will be increasing the outstanding principal amount because we're now also adding that unpaid interest. And Mr. President, in the interest of being fair to the creditors, we have to make sure the creditors don't lose because they're also taking a risk. But what this does is give them surety in relation, Mr. President, to the money that they have loaned. But like I said, Mr. President, I want to continually stress this is an option that we can use in order, Mr. President, to be able to address an immediate situation where there is a natural disaster and we need immediate liquidity as well. And Mr. President, again, when we talk about the notion of having that 2-year window as well, when you look at the constitutional amendments, what it does say is that we can only use the deferral payments 3 times. So that if you have a loan that is 30 years, 25 years, you are only allowed 3 instances in which you can use that deferral instrument as well. So we are not having an instrument that is willy-nilly, that is being applied based on our standards or how we feel. When you look at the constitutional amendments, it indicates that it is done specifically in a specific context of the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, Mr. President. Again, so that there is surety for everyone that there is an objective analysis of what that natural disaster is, what it means, Mr. President, and then how also as well it can be measured. And Mr. President, I want to read from the Constitutional Amendment, this one for the External Loan Act, Cap 94D, where it says at 10A, where a natural disaster has occurred in respect of which a policy payment was made to the government under the CCRIF policy. And that is important because it also means that you have to have a policy that shows that you are attempting to insure the country against the occurrence, Mr. President. So again, you are saying that we are not then just invoking this because we want to stop payments, but that we have taken the necessary measures as much as we can, Mr. President, in order to be able to insure against. So it says here, again, that the payment was made to the government under the CCRIF policy and subject to subsection 2 of that substantive legislation, the government may elect to defer the payment of the principal, amortizations, and interest payments to holders of the security on the date of the payment under the securities. Mr. President also goes on to say as well, in terms of the conditions, at section 2A, it says that the CCRIF policy is in effect, and CCRIF has issued a written report confirming that the natural disaster is an insured event in respect of which a CCRIF policy payment has been made to Barbados. So again, an independent agency is writing a report to verify the occurrence has actually happened and that there is a policy and a payment was made. At B, it indicates that neither the coverage limit nor the exhaustion point applicable to the insured event has been reduced by CCRIF or by the government. And also as well at C, it indicates that the reference model loss to Barbados from the natural disaster is greater than 10 million. Greater than 10 million. So it establishes specific conditions, Mr. President. Specific conditions, again, for invoking that natural disaster clause. And this is important in order to ensure, again, that for our creditors, that there's predictability. Because the government has not intended that through these clauses, that we put ourselves back in a situation where our creditors don't have confidence in us. And essentially, Mr. President, eroding the integrity of the system and the process. But by ensuring that we have these conditions as stipulated, again, by independent agencies, and when we come to talk about the pandemic clauses, you would see, Mr. President, as well within the constitutional amendments, that that is also dependent, again, on specific criteria, on specific circumstances being in place in order then to give effect into the government invoking the use of the natural disaster and pandemic clause. Mr. President, so that this insurance facility that we've been talking about, the CCRIF, it provides short-term liquidity. It allows for government to be able to receive a payout in 14 days after an event. In 14 days after an event. So it's an important facility. It provides insurance in areas that traditional insurers would not give protection. And therefore, for the governments that are involved, it is an important facility for us to be able to cover some critical events. But it offers, Mr. President, what is called parametric insurance. And what parametric insurance is that essentially it gives a payout on a defined, a specified event. So it's not that you can say you've had a natural disaster, but under the CCRIF framework, you identify specifically. So CCRIF has or provides that insurance in specific areas: earthquakes, cyclones, I think it is an occurrence of excess rainfall, fisheries, and it also as well provides insurance to the electric utilities as well. So it is defined. And they have a methodology, Mr. President, in which how the parametric insurance works. So you have a specific event, and it is paid a set amount based on the magnitude of the event and not the magnitude of the losses of the event, the magnitude of the event. So they're able to calculate whether it is wind speeds, whether it's how much saturation you've had on the ground, etc. And therefore you get that payout based on that scientific calculation. And again, what that does is, again, give creditors assurance that we are applying this, Mr. President, invoking this clause in a way then that is independent. Mr. President, to date, CCRIF has had 59 payouts totaling $260 million US to 16 governments. The Barbados government itself has benefited, as I said before, in the wake of Tropical Storm Kirk. We would have got $5.8 million from CCRIF over the period 2010 to 2021, I believe. We would have received a total of just over $21 million US from CCRIF. Now, Mr. President, there'll be those that would say, then, well, we got insurance. So why would you need to have these natural disaster and pandemic clauses if you have this insurance and you will get this payout that works? Mr. President, I have health insurance. A number of Barbadians have health insurance. And what happens when you go for major surgery? The insurance will pay some, and you got to pay some as well, right? You got to pay some as well. So the insurance is not often able to meet the full threshold of the need. So again, the government is giving itself an option where that insurance payout does not meet the full threshold, Mr. President, of the need. Where it does, then we will not need to invoke the natural disaster and the pandemic clause. It is, again, where we have event and the magnitude that we need that level of quick liquidity, Mr. President, that we can give ourselves that space in order then to be able to invoke the clause. I also want to note that this is important in terms of the necessary policy space. Because as we've talked about here in this place already, we live, Mr. President, as small and developing states in a world in which the large majority of resources for building climate resilience, the large majority of resources for doing social development from either development partners, multilateral banks, etc., do not come to the region. Do not come to the region, Mr. President. Only 15% of finance, only 15% of finance is going to countries that are on the front line of the climate crisis, while 75% of the poor actually live in middle-income countries that have been graduated from accessing finance, Mr. President. So you find yourselves then in a space where there are not many options. It is not that you can go out there and just find money, Mr. President. So again, having policy tools and space allows the government then to be able to have, as I keep saying, Mr. President, the necessary breathing room when we need to have it, and that is important. So we would have come through that period, and like I said, having in 2018, Mr. President, and then in 2019, once we would have agreed with our international creditors in terms of debt restructuring, of making sure that all of those new instruments had natural disaster clauses within it. But of course, nobody could have predicted the pandemic. So up until that point, our instruments would have only had natural disaster clauses and not pandemic clauses. So we'd have come through, Mr. President, a pandemic that cost the government $1 billion, Mr. President, $1 billion, $390 million in increased health and welfare costs, and over $600 million of lost revenue for this country as tourism declined and businesses closed, Mr. President. We would know that the government had to look for money to build a shield around the country and the citizens, Mr. President. Where do we find those resources? How does a country find those resources quickly and at hand in order to create that shield? And this government did it, Mr. President. We did it. The evidence is there. We introduced the business interruption loan, Mr. President, for people. We ensured that we provided for the most vulnerable to the Barbados Vulnerable Family Survival Program, which required at the onset over US $10 million and targeted 115 of the most vulnerable families who would receive $600 a month. We had to stand up the facility at Harrison Point, Mr. President. We had to create a shield. We had to create a shield. And therefore, having come through the pandemic and living through that experience, and knowing that it meant, therefore, that we had to be able to learn from that experience, in 2022, when the government was negotiating with the IDB and Nature Conservancy for the debt swap, then we looked to make sure that those instruments included not only natural disaster, but then as well the inclusion of a pandemic clause, Mr. President, the inclusion of a pandemic clause. So again, Mr. President, I hope that we can see that this is a government that is learning, a government that is intended to make sure that we are able to provide for our citizens, a government that is not willing to sit back and wait and see what will happen, but that we are using as much policy tools to create the necessary space in order to address circumstances that remain, Mr. President, unpredictable. Unpredictable, but we plan. Unpredictable, Mr. President, but we plan. Mr. President, that IDB and Nature Conservancy, and I want to be very clear, again, that this is not the government taking on more debt, Mr. President. Actually, it was actually a very innovative instrument that allowed the government to move the savings from its debt towards environmental sustainability. And it actually as well has become a blueprint and a best practice in many instances, Mr. President, internationally as well, for how a government can channel once it is able to find the right partners. And I want to say that we were lucky to have both the IDB and Nature Conservancy working with us in this way in order to give effect to this particular transaction. Through this debt swap, Mr. President, we had a reduced debt burden by swapping debt for environmental projects so that we can actually reduce our national debt. Through these swaps, we were able to secure more favorable interest rates, leading to long-term financial savings and as well improved environmental management. Again, Mr. President, using as much innovation, as much policy tools as we can in order to be able to address the circumstances. Mr. President, this discussion around the natural disaster and pandemic clauses cannot be had unless we also discuss this government's international advocacy as well, and in particular, the Bridgetown Initiative. I know many Barbadians will say that they don't understand what it is. They don't understand why the Prime Minister flying all around, talking to all of these people, what it means when we have national things here to be able to take care of. What does it have to do with us? What does it have to do with us? What does the Bridgetown Initiative have to do with us? And Mr. President, I want to speak to some of the results of the Bridgetown Initiative, because it is the Bridgetown Initiative that is creating space for us at the global level that is allowing us then to be able to see a change in the financial architecture and how, again, multilateral banks will treat to governments like ours, and in particular treat to debt, and how we can ensure that we are able to finance our climate resilience program, Mr. President. And there have been several successes from this Bridgetown Initiative, Mr. President, if you permit. So one, Mr. President, under our call for the provision of immediate liquidity support under the Bridgetown Initiative, there has been an agreement for the IMF to rechannel the special drawing rights, 100 billion in special drawing rights for vulnerable countries, and 60 million of which is already in a fund for vulnerable countries. The reform of the global debt agriculture. Mr. President, we have realized progress on individual country level, such as debt restructuring deals for Ghana, Zambia, and a debt for nature swap in Ecuador, Belize, and Barbados. The IADB offering, listen, Mr. President, natural disaster clauses in all new and existing loan agreements in conjunction with the contingency liquidity facility. Barbados is one of the highest users of natural disaster clauses. And now through the advocacy of the Bridgetown Initiative, we see more, not only countries, but also institutions, multilateral institutions, using them as well in their agreements, meaning that we pass on that option to other countries, Mr. President, would find themselves in the same position. The World Bank has pledged to integrate natural disaster clauses, but only in this case for the principle of new loans. World Bank is considering interest rate reductions to incentivize exiting coal as part of the energy transition. The EIB, Mr. President, has extended loan terms to 30 years within 10 years grace period. Because before, what we had argued was that the loan periods, Mr. President, were too long when you were doing rebuilding and reconstruction. You can't give me a 15-year loan. Reconstruction and rebuilding takes time. So that, again, is a fundamental win. We've also seen a sustainable debt coalition that is devising and advocating for debt reduction as well. And Mr. President, there are many more wins that we have realized from the Bridgetown initiative as pioneered by the Prime Minister. We have a Bridgetown initiative unit as well, Mr. President, because one of the things that we are doing, we are not just, Mr. President, saying that we will use this policy instrument in order to give ourselves that breathing space, but we're also making sure that we address the big issue of building resilience, because that is fundamental as well. We plan, yes, to ensure that we have that space if we need it, but also as well, the focus is on building national resilience. And out of that Bridgetown unit, we have seen, Mr. President, the development of what we call an investment map. What that investment map does for us, Mr. President, it allows us to be able to look critically and to prioritize the critical areas that we need investment in should an event occur. And it also allows us to analyze where we are now in terms of our resilience and where we need to get to. That also then, Mr. President, has a visualization map as well. And it allows us to take a look at the country to be able to layer that with data. So not only just, Mr. President, looking at coastal and lowline areas and what will happen in the case of a sea surge, but we can then layer that with poverty data and then actually then be able to see those areas of low-income households that may be vulnerable to flooding and other events. Again, so a planning tool in order then to be able to, for us to then see then how we'll be able to move in and what we need to do in terms of building infrastructure in those areas. That then goes in hand then with also a practical investment plan, as I was saying, Mr. President. And that investment plan, once we have those priorities, will then allow us to then be able to go to the international market, to international development partners with a clear idea of where we would want investment in order for us then to build our resilience, Mr. President. Then this is added to a number of other initiatives, of course, the government is doing in terms of building resilience in the housing stock. In 2022, we did a housing stock assessment that was done by the Ministry of Housing in collaboration with the University of the West Indies, so that we again would have an idea of the level of vulnerability in our housing stock, and working in collaboration then with the DEM, then to have better information for targeted interventions. And this again also is aligned to the government's roof strap programs, because then we are able to identify those vulnerable households that will most likely need, Mr. President, that assistance with the roof strap program. So I'm saying all of this to suggest that we are not only creating that policy space, but we are also very practically addressing those issues of how we build resilience. That is one of the reasons why we have our Roof to Roost program. One of the reasons why we have done and passed a new physical development plan, Mr. President. Why we have passed a biodiversity plan, Mr. President. Because we understand what can happen later. And in order to make sure that we have the necessary framework that allows us. But even as we talk about building resilience, Mr. President, and making sure that we do that, we have to plan for what might happen in the interim. And these natural disaster and pandemic clauses are about helping the government to be able to help us address those eventualities, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I close, I want to note that this government has shown itself to be one that is capable of addressing, one, at the socio-economic development level, the needs of its citizens, Mr. President. It has shown itself to have good stewardship of the economy. You would note, Mr. President, that last year we were adjudged the 5th fastest growing economy, Mr. President. And that says a lot from a country that just, how much years ago? 4 years ago, Mr. President, was on its knees. But we have done so, Mr. President, through good stewardship. And these natural disaster and pandemic clauses continue to be part of our strategy to be able again to demonstrate that stewardship, Mr. President. I therefore commend this legislation, commend this bill, Mr. President, to this House. I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Monroe-Knight. Please beg to move that read a second time.
Yes. Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you very much. Speakers, Senator Drakes.
Good afternoon to the chamber. Happy New Year to all. And I really do look forward to robust debate in the year of 2024. I think we've started off on a good note this morning. But Mr. President, we are here debating this afternoon the Debt, Natural Disaster and Pandemic Deferment of Payment Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2024. And sir, I think the Honorable Senator who made the opening contribution, Senator Dr. Monroe-Knight, did an excellent job of framing why these clauses are being introduced and the context. And Mr. President, what I want to do in this debate this afternoon is to take an even deeper assessment of what these clauses mean and why we have to institute them into our policy framework. Mr. President, many times when we have these discussions, we are usually talking about the end result. We are talking about things like climate change. We are talking about things like building resilience. But there's very little discussion about how we got here and the things that need to change in order to redirect the course that we are on. And sir, in my discussion this afternoon, I want to talk about 4 key areas that we sometimes talk about them together, but we are not explicit in how they are connected. Sir, and those 4 areas are the economy, debt, energy, and climate change. Those 4 areas, Mr. President. Because how those 4 areas are connected and intertwined, Mr. President, is the reason why we're coming here today to pass this bill. Mr. President, I want to first start by saying a few things about the Barbados debt position. Because a lot of the times when we hear the debates about our debt, it is confined to what is happening in Barbados. Mr. President, in 2023, the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean with the highest debt to GDP levels were, first, Venezuela at 157%, second, Barbados at 115% debt to GDP. Coming down the line, third was Suriname, 112%, Dominica, 96%, Brazil, 88%. So, sir, in relation to our brothers and sisters across Latin America and the Caribbean, we still see that we have a relatively high debt to GDP level, despite the debt coming down from a high of, I know it was 148% debt to GDP. I believe that was in 2021. And that is documented based on data coming out of one, the central bank, and two, the World Bank. But sir, the national debt in its totality at the end of last year was $14 billion, just about $14 billion. I don't know, we had a press conference this morning by the central bank. Maybe those numbers may be revised, but I haven't seen any news reports as yet about the report from 2023. But the last reported figure was $14 billion. $9 billion was allocated to local debt, and $5 billion, Mr. President, is in relation to what we owe our external creditors, or what we call our external debt. Sir, and when you look at the breakdown of that external debt, all of it is long-term debt. All of it is long-term debt, and as we know, must be paid in foreign exchange. Sir, and despite debt to GDP falling from that high of 148%, what is interesting is when you look at the data, is that our external debt position has been increasing slowly in the last decade. In 2013, Mr. President, our external debt was $2.8 billion, and it stayed around that point up until 2018. It reached $3.2 billion in 2018. And of course, because of COVID, Mr. President, in 2020, we reached $3.9 billion. And by 2021, we had broken the $4 billion barrier at $4.4 billion. And 2023, as I said, we are now at $5 billion. So when we hear persons talking about the debt and why are we bringing on board more debt or putting ourselves into more debt, it is not necessarily, I think, Mr. President, a case sometimes of not understanding that as a small area in developing states, we will need debt to finance the operations of the economy. But Barbadians are relatively risk-averse persons and will have some reservation about the amount of debt that we've taken on in the last 4 to 5 years, albeit all of the things that preceded having to take on the debt, like the pandemic, ashfall, etc., Mr. President. But sir, when you look at that external debt and you start to break it down, as I said, it's all long-term debt, and you average it about 20, on a 20-year time span, that's the equivalent of $250 million per year that we would have to pay back. $250 million per year, Mr. President. Breaking it down even further at the individual level, that's $909 per capita each year for 20 years. $909 per capita each year for 20 years in external debt alone, Mr. President. And that's just the principle. That's just the principle, Mr. President. And as we know, the situation as it relates to interest rates globally have been changing, and we've now entered a space where cheap or accessible financing is becoming scarce. And the average global interest rate is expected to peak sometime this year at around 5%, Mr. President, despite us still acquiring debt well above that at 7% as we passed last year, Mr. President. But as we were told, for good reason. Mr. President, these rising interest rates then mean it will become more difficult in the future to service these debts and eventually crowd out, or may eventually crowd out, our ability to meet our basic needs in terms of the social services, healthcare, education, roads, etc., Mr. President. And hence why I believe, Mr. President, like the Honorable Senator Monroe Knight, these natural disaster clauses and pandemic clauses are necessary in the event that we are hit with an extreme weather event and there's a humanitarian crisis that needs to be dealt with immediately. The government must have the room to be able to deal with these issues. But sir, outside of these emergency situations and disasters, what is clear is that we simply, and I've said this in this chamber already, we simply do not earn enough money, Mr. President, in a small economy like ours to cover our expenses. And moving into an era, Mr. President, where debt is becoming an issue globally, I ask the question if we can reduce our reliance on debt, even if the economy does not grow, and what then are our policy options? Can we reduce our reliance on debt, even if the economy does not grow, and what are our policy options? And so I think having that discussion, framing it in that way, we've been finding ourselves in a position where there are policy options that we may have not thought about before that we can implement, Mr. President, and reap greater rewards even when the economy grows. But Mr. President, the business as usual is always to rely on the assumption that the economy grows and therefore we will be able to service the debt. But sir, Barbados is not alone in this debt problem. We are not. And this is where I want to take a bird's eye view on this issue, Mr. President. Sovereign debt and debt held by private households and corporations, Mr. President, globally, is starting to become a serious issue in some financial corners. And there are some experts that believe that the system may not hold up under the level of debt that is in the system. Sir, for instance, even in large advanced economies like Japan, Japan has a debt to GDP of 255% as of last year. The US, a debt to GDP of 123%, and China, Mr. President, a debt to GDP of 287%, Mr. President. And I go further with this issue of debt. Sir, in 2023, the Institute of International Finance estimated global debt to hit a record of $307 trillion. $307 trillion. And if you put that into the context of how much we earn as a species, I would say, because it's all human beings now that I'm talking about. This is global debt, Mr. President. Global debt to GDP is 336%. So here in Barbados, when we have a debt to GDP of 115%, it is just a microcosm, Mr. President, of what is happening globally. There is a large amount of debt in the financial system. And there are many persons who are warning of a collapse. Mr. President, the IMF and the World Bank have also stated in a report last year that 60% of low-income countries are at or near debt stress levels. And that is where they will be unable to fulfill their financial obligations. Mr. President, and in that context, we have to ask ourselves, as the Honorable Senator who tabled the bill, how do we become resilient in the face of that environment, Mr. President? Sir, but I go further and say that we know that debt is a claim on future earnings. It is a claim on future earnings. We acquire it today with the promise of paying it back based on earnings in the future. But fundamentally, sir, where the conversation must also go now, in the context of climate change, that is also a claim on future energy use and physical and natural resources. So if we have a large amount of debt already in the system that we have to repay, do we have the energy available and the physical and natural resources available to pay back what is owed, Mr. President? And sir, despite having that connection between future economic activity that is based on energy and physical resources, Mr. President, that instruments are not issued based on projections of energy availability and natural resources. Countries find themselves in a situation where they need debt, and debt is issued, Mr. President. So therefore, what we have is a situation where bonds and the bond market and the debt market, Mr. President, are actually disconnected from the real economy. You have a monetary system that is disconnected from the real economy, Mr. President. And that is actually the only way, Mr. President, that we can have such large levels of debt and deficits, Mr. President, in the system. But that context is not said very often. You have a monetary system that is operating almost independently of the things that it requires for the productive activity to pay back the debt that is being created in the monetary system and the financial system, Mr. President. So, sir, countries like Barbados, when we acquire debt, we just assume that the economy will grow and we will have the resources available to pay back the debt in the future. But, sir, we never hear my fellow colleagues, economists, and central bankers ask questions like, will we have enough energy in the future, enough natural resources in the future to sustain GDP levels, Mr. President, to repay the existing debt levels? Because that is not their concern. Yet the very things that they're not concerned about, or they're not in their direct purview, are the inputs needed for the repayment of the debt, Mr. President. Mr. President, I don't know why I'm hearing asides. I am not saying anything controversial. I'm just explaining a topic area, Mr. President. Mr. President, I continue.
I'm not hearing any asides. I'm hearing
Okay,
you
any
perfectly
asides,
well.
Mr. President.
Are you making a very solid point? I'm listening to you very clearly.
Good, Mr. President.
I'm not hearing any aside.
Good, Mr. President. So then you ask the question, if these things are true, if these things hold true, Mr. President, then why is the debt rising? Why does it keep rising? How have we reached the point where we are over $300 trillion globally? Why does the debt keep rising? Sir, the simple answer is that because our economic systems require persons to consume over and above their basic needs for the economy to grow. That's the simple answer. So when people do not have the means to acquire more material things, what do? We give them the credit. And that is, Mr. President, the crux of the matter. So now we have economies that are driven by this concept that they must grow in perpetuity based on materialism, all bought on credit. I don't know if that's a good way to design a society, but sir, here we are. Capitalism at its finest, Mr. President. And as much as we want to emulate countries that we say, you know, they are growing fast, Mr. President, and they are advanced economies. Sir, even China, since 2008, would be one of those countries persons would look at and say they have been doing well. Since the Great Recession in 2008, China has been able to grow its economy. Sir, China's economy at $13 trillion was created based on $55 trillion of debt. $13 trillion, but based on $55 trillion of debt, Mr. President. And sir, the reason why this vicious cycle continues to occur is because the economy needs constant growth. We saw it in the pandemic. From the time you stop any one of those factors, whether it's consumer expenditure, government expenditure, production of goods and services, the entire economy collapses. It does not have the resilience for anything other than all areas to grow, because they're all reinforcing factors. The government needs the private sector to produce, they need consumers to consume, and on and on and on the cycle goes, Mr. President. But sir, we go even deeper into this assessment, because as we buy and we sell and we tax and we provide social services and everything else, what we know as the modern economy post-industrial revolution, the industrial revolution, is all based on fossil fuel use. And that is something we cannot escape. What we know as modern civilization today is because of cheap, abundant fossil fuels that we have mined. Sir, and the burning of that fossil fuel, the waste product of that process that has facilitated all of this advancement, is what we call now global warming and climate change. So we come full circle, Mr. President, full circle. And those persons who, and this may sound strange even coming from me, who have this fallacy that we're just going to stop using fossil fuels, stop oil. So where are you going to get things like tar, asphalt, fertilizers, even your toothbrush, Mr. President, the plastic in your toothbrush, the wooden ones, trees, forestry degradation. So there's varied, and even if you say that you can't use wooden tools in surgery. So we are so deeply connected to fossil fuels. There is a galloping towards stopping the use of it, which is understandable because of the CO2 emissions. But no one has said to anybody, anywhere in the globe, what that economy post-fossil fuel looks like. No one. Because, Mr. President, even the byproducts from the refinement of oil are found everywhere in each household across the globe once you've crossed a certain standard of living. So are we going to then tell persons, well, you can't buy that many TVs, you can't have 3 and 4 cars parked outside your house, even if they're EVs, the wheels have to, the tires have to come from somewhere. We're getting the rubber from. And that is the dilemma that we find ourselves in. That is the dilemma we find ourselves in, Mr. President. It is not a sexy political message. It is not. It is creeping into the discussion across other parts of the globe, but certainly here in the Caribbean, this discussion is not happening, Mr. President. And sir, when I talk about us being unable to even see how energy intensive the economies that we currently reside in are. Take, for example, and I'll use the TV. A television just doesn't appear, it comes from somewhere. The minerals, the metals, the glass, the plastics, the circuit boards, everything has to come from somewhere. There are physical resources that go into building the TV. Then once you have the parts, you have to assemble them. If it's coming from China, most likely a coal-powered plant, more fossil fuels, Mr. President. Then once it's assembled, it gets on a ship using heavy fuel oil. And as we heard this morning, that ship takes a nice sojourn across the globe, continuing to burn fossil fuels, Mr. President. Then it lands on our shores and it leaves the port. And I haven't seen any 16-wheeler EVs yet in Barbados. Last time I checked, they're all using diesel, more fossil fuels. And then we have a culture that says, consumers, come and buy your TVs for Christmas. Come and buy them for Christmas. And neither the importers in Barbados or the consumers have thought about how that television has got to them. And even, they don't care, but the society has told them they don't have to care. It is convenience that they have to care about. There's the affluence that you have to care about. And even worse, Mr. President, even worse, because we talk about the fossil fuels on the front end in terms of the production, but there's no natural waste stream for a lot of these products that we are creating, Mr. President. Don't worry, I'm going to get full circle, Mr. President. Sir, what we are doing essentially is saying to persons, when you buy that television, the retail sector, once they've sold over and above last year's amount, the economy has done well. The economy has done well, Mr. President. But at no point do we capture the environmental costs or the energy costs for that TV to get to your doorstep and for you to use it. And furthermore, Mr. President, there's no integrated way for us to recycle, upcycle a lot of these products that we are now using as modern conveniences, Mr. President. And so that is at the heart of the problem that we face as a global society. Sir, having, as a small island developing state, now having to institute a natural disaster and a pandemic clause is a result of what I have just described. We have to come here to bring clauses to our debt instruments because we are living in a society that is based on economies that require cheap energy. That cheap energy at the moment happens to be fossil fuels. That, Mr. President, has resulted in what we know now as climate change. And climate change is just one byproduct of our economic model. I haven't talked about the biodiversity loss. I haven't talked about what's happening with our oceans in terms of ocean acidification, the coral bleaching, etc., Mr. President. We have an economy that it has to grow within a finite planet. And we have not found a way, Mr. President, that can sustain what we do now, yeah, without fossil fuels. And people will say renewable energy. People will say, we can do it through renewable energy, green growth, the green economy, Mr. President. What I would say to that is, unless businesses are incentivized in a way that makes them value the environmental sustainability and social sustainability, along with profitability, Mr. President, we will always convert to the business as usual. Profitability will always come first. And therefore, we will have the issues like greenwashing, where companies pretend to be sustainable. But when you look in the back end, they're not sustainable. That's why you get now things like the fraud that's happening in the carbon offsetting markets. People claiming to say, yes, we're gonna set up this industry and we're gonna offset our carbon by, putting mangroves in some other area of the world. And when you go, the mangroves ain't growing, Mr. President, so how are you carbon offsetting? Why? Because the goal will still always be economic growth. Mr. President? Sir, we are at a point now where even with renewables and the mixed results that we're seeing across countries, in 2023, the average temperature was 1.18 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, and that's how we measure the balance in terms of the warming of the climate and where we're going. And as we know, as small island developing states, we've set that threshold that we as countries can withstand is 1.5 degrees Celsius, Mr. President. So if renewables are to play a part, it has to be at pace and scale. But sir, listen to this. Last year, global coal production peaked at 50,000 terawatt hours, peaked. We used more coal last year, Mr. President, on record. So people talking about renewables, but nobody ain't talking about what happened with coal production. Mr. President. Sir, in a publication entitled Energy Production and Consumption, the authors stated, the growing energy consumption makes the challenge of transitioning our energy systems away from fossil fuels towards low carbon sources of energy more difficult. New low carbon energy has to meet this additional demand and try to displace existing fossil fuels in the energy mix. So it is not a case, sir, that we are replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy, Mr. President. We're just adding renewable energies onto the energy consumption. That's what's happening globally. And we are not, sometimes we get caught up with the rhetoric, not looking at the whole pie, the whole picture of what's happening holistically, Mr. President. So I just want to make this point as well. There's a paper by Dr. Nate Hadgens in 2020. It's called The Economics of the Future Beyond the Superorganism. And he says, if the global economy continues to grow at about 3% per year, which is what the economists want. Everybody in society wants that. We want our economies to grow. He continues and says, we will consume as much energy and materials in the next 30 years as we did cumulatively in the past 10,000 years. The next 30 years, if we want our economies to grow, we will use the amount of energy and materials as we as human beings have used in the last 10,000 years, Mr. President. Sir, I say all of this to say, because there's a lot more what I have in my notes, Mr. President. But I am wrapping up, sir. I say this to say, Mr. President, the bill before us, I believe, yes, provides temporary financial solutions to a bigger problem that we face. And the Honorable Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight spoke about how do we plan in unpredictability. And my thinking has shifted a lot regarding this. I think, Mr. President, based on what I've said today, we need a development committee that comprises of physicists, ecologists, economists, sociologists, Mr. President, because what we are faced with, Mr. President, are social systems that are butting up against the laws of nature. Butting up against the laws of nature, Mr. President. And until we find sustainable ways and uses of energy use, Mr. President, and material use, which are in the realm of what physicists call thermodynamics, Mr. President. As I said, there are a lot of things now that I'm opening my eyes to, and that's why I'm apprising the chamber and those who can hear me of. I don't know how many Caribbean physicists are working on development planning. I don't know none, Mr. President. How many engineers are integrated into our development planning, Mr. President? And so we need experts that not only understand their field, but we need those experts to understand how decisions that they make impact all of the other components of the system, because that is where we're falling down. We do not have a systemic understanding of how our society works, how nature works, and sir, how we can plan for the future, Mr. President. So I commend the bill, Mr. President, but I still believe, Mr. President, it is a temporary financial solution to what is fundamentally, Mr. President, a problem of the laws of physics and nature that we as a society have not weaned ourselves back in, so that we do not have to bring bills that are dealing with the result of mass consumerism and hyper-consumerism, Mr. President. Mr. President, you keep saying to wrap up.
We're not for this time, nor is I will listen to you all day long. I've enjoyed it thoroughly.
Mr. President, it's an area that I'm passionate about.
I'm taking it as the prologue to a larger work.
That's no problem, Mr. President. Mr. President, I hope that what I've said this afternoon is well received, and I look forward to the government championing other areas of these issues outside of providing those financial solutions, because there's a lot more that needs to be done, Mr. President, in terms of where the world must go in terms of a development framework. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much for your very outstanding contribution, Senator Drakes. I look forward to your larger body of work to come. Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. President. Please do not have any expectations based on the previous speaker, because I will not be presenting a magnum opus here today. Mr. President, will be speaking very simply, and you know, in some ways, what I would like to say on this piece of legislation is similar in a way to what Senator Drakes was saying, in a way. And, you know, while she was talking, I was there saying, it sounds like we have to deal with the Babylon system, right? But anyway, those are just thoughts that were stimulated in my brain and are not directly connected to that which I have prepared to speak about today. So we are dealing with, I want to get the name of the legislation correct because it's quite long. We are dealing with Debt, Natural Disaster and Pandemic Deferment of Payment Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2023. And one of the things that I found interesting, and I've been following some of the natural disaster clauses. I have been following them for a bit of time. I noted Grenada was the first one, I believe, in 2004. I believe Senator Monroe Knight alluded to that. And since then, these have become more popular. And they are a useful innovation. And I think it is a good thing for us to note that that we can innovate. The people of the Caribbean, of small island states, we are innovative. We are not just recipients of policy, although sometimes it seems that way. We are also people who make policy because of the situations in which we live. We know how to live in precarity. We have to be nimble. We have to find ways to survive. And this is one of these examples of exactly that. It is not perfect, but perhaps in this situation, the system that Senator Drakes described, it may be the best that we can do at this stage to address what we are dealing with. So, Mr. President, I find these kinds of approaches to be very interesting. And for me, I really look forward to, I don't look forward to a natural disaster or another pandemic. Let's get that straight. But in the event that one occurs, and these will occur in various places, I am really interested to see how these will work and what they will provide for countries that end up using them, unfortunately, if they have to use them. And I say this because these are still relatively new. So right now we are all in the stage of knowing the pros of these, the benefits of these. We are not at the point yet of being able to say what the drawbacks may be somewhere down the road. So there are a few things that I would like to say, very few. This made me think about, looking at this legislation made me think about what Senator Monroe Knight said when I was thinking about this last night. About during the pandemic and when we have our individual problems, we may need to go to the banks and say, we are having a problem, give us some assistance, help us out here. And during the pandemic, this occurred with the banks. Some of them, the banks and other financial institutions that lend, whether it is the ones that specifically lend for vehicle loans and so on, were able to provide individuals with some of this space during the pandemic if people lost their jobs and so on. And I remember that some people were alarmed when they had to restart their payments because people thought that what this meant was that they would just, let's say your interest payment was $900 a month. You would just start back paying $900 a month. But people did not really realize that what occurred was during that time, when they were not making payments, they were still accruing interest. And this interest was being added on to principal. And this could affect what they had to repay at the point when they start repaying. Or it affects their payoff amount. It affects the payoff amount. And these are things that, although using the experience of private individuals, regular people, these are things that we should also be aware of. And I think Senator Monroe Knight made this relatively clear as well, that these amounts are going to be added. She noted that they would be tacked on to the end. I don't really see them as being tacked on to the end because they're going to be added to the principal. So this would then likely affect interest rates. And while it is clear that these kinds of clauses, this legislation before us that puts in place these kinds of clauses and uses a very clever mechanism of using the CCRIF, their evaluation of the devastation in a natural disaster as evidence then. So I think that's quite innovative. So while we have this, I'm not certain that people are aware of the fact that this will have implications for the debt in Barbados. Okay, it will have implications for the debt, but not to the extent as if we, as a country, had to take out additional loans. That is true. But our debt level will not be the same when we start repaying as it was before, even if we have not taken out new loans to address the natural disaster or the pandemic or whatever it is that occurs. So there will be some increases. Why do I bring this to people's attention? Not because this is an objection, because we know how it is you know, as ostentatious as the banks are bringing it back to the domestic level with the rebranding and drone shows and, you know, and then they give a little charity and thing. Yeah. So as ostentatious as they are not willing to forego some of their profit to give us a little ease because we faced the pandemic or some personal situation. And if we translate this to the international level, the benevolence does not extend so far as to put a pause on interest accruing during this time, believe it or not, when people face a natural disaster. So it's not that there's love in the hearts of these entities that have loaned us money. But what this kind of pandemic clause allows for creditors is to have a level of certainty. Senator Monroe Knight mentioned it. And it also makes life a little bit easier for them as well, because they don't have to deal with restructuring negotiations. If you need to go and restructure your debt, you have to go and enter all kinds of negotiations back and forth between creditor and debtor. So this also makes it easier for these entities who are unlikely to be willing to say, we will just put a pause on those interest payments, and at the end of your disaster, when you have made sure that your people are all right, your infrastructure has been addressed, your school system, your water supply, etc., has been restored to a basic level, you can resume paying. Because there's not that in this system that Senator Drake rightly explained. In this system, there is not that. Even by the most profitable of entities, there's not that. So the best we can do, the second best option, the best we can do is provide this kind of deferral that then means that there will be some increase in the debt level. And this is important to note because it also speaks about the need for countries such as ours, for this country, as we are here now, to ensure that in the event that there are these disasters, and we hope that we will not have any, and that if we do, that they will be relatively mild and we can recover well from them. But in the event that such things occur, it is imperative that small island states are prudent with their finances, can manage finances appropriately, that we deal with things like corruption, which we have very little of according to Transparency International, compared to other countries in the world. We're at number 24, so hooray. Which is good. I'm not belittling this point, but there is still a way to go, and I have my issues with Transparency International, which we will not, their assessment of corruption, because it is a perception-based measure, not an actual measure of what happens in these countries. But that's for another day and another time. It's another day for another day and another time. The point that I am seeking to make is that even a place that is vulnerable to all kinds of disasters, that is vulnerable to climate change, we have to ensure that the economy continues to do well. It has to do well, because at the end of that deferment, when the payments have to start again and the debt has increased, we have to find ways to continue paying that debt and doing all of the other things that the country needs to do, and to try and see how we can continue to work on our debt to GDP level, continue to work on our debt load, debt burden, so that this country, our country, is not in a difficult situation, a situation that most of us voted to get out of. We want to ensure that we do not end up there again. So this means that while this legislation is useful for addressing the kinds of events that we do not want to see happen, we have to take them for what they are. They are measures, second best measures in my estimation. They're measures to help us cope in a difficult situation, but they do not do things such as provide us with additional money. They're not providing us with additional money in order to do things that we need to do. They're saving us from using the limited resources that we have for a 2-year period. We're using them now to deal with the issues we have rather than paying down debt. But at the end of that period, we still have to think about how are we going to pay down our debts? How are we going to have a sustainable debt to GDP level? How are we going to grow our economies in ways that are not exploitative of our people? So it's not just about economies growing, but economies growing in ways that people get to feel and experience. Because it's hollow for us to say that the economy is growing and people feel as if their lives are worse than they were when the economy wasn't growing or was stagnating or something. So that I do not go off on a tangent, Mr. President, I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Hines. Senator Dr. Haynes.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. President. I rise briefly to speak on these amendments because I think it's critical that we recognize the importance of some of the measures that we have taken in this House in the last few years related to managing our debt. And this is another measure that I think is highly commendable because we know that crises are costly. Only last week, the Doomsday Clock, if you've ever heard of it, the Doomsday Clock was established by a group of atomic scientists back in 1947. And the idea is that as we get closer to midnight, we're getting closer to catastrophe. Last week, the Doomsday Clock was put at 90 seconds to midnight, suggesting that the world is at a tipping point where we're seeing more wars, more famine, more hurricanes, more disasters. And it is with that understanding that we are trying to take measures to ensure that we can be better able to withstand the shocks, the external shocks that tend to disproportionately affect small island states. The IMF tells us that small island states are 4.5 times more likely than large states to experience disaster-related damage in proportion to GDP. We know that because of our geographical positioning, that we here in the Caribbean are in a particular situation where we know that with the global temperatures are rising. Last year was the hottest year on record. We have a situation where there's increasing threat of drought with more consecutive days of lack of rainfall. There's an increased risk of coastal inundation because of rising sea levels. All of these threats put us at risk. And what these measures are seeking to do is to acknowledge that we can ensure that in the event that we experience, God forbid, another major hurricane, or in the event that we experience a pandemic, that we can be in a situation where we don't have to tap into resources that would have otherwise been okay, I am going to just make specific reference to what I wanted to address that Dr. Drake's made reference to, which was our situation on the debt. Sorry.
She's prophesying.
Sorry. Right, just quickly, I wanted to make reference to our position on the debt. The central bank governor's report was released today. I know a very gloomy picture was seemingly put out, and I wanted to make specific reference to the fact that even in the aftermath of COVID, where we saw our debt to GDP rise to 150%, the IMF report that was released last year, July, did indeed point out that Barbados is back on a sustainable trajectory downward in terms of managing our debt. We have been able to reduce our debt to GDP. Today, debt to GDP is down from 150% at the peak of COVID down to 115.5%. We also know that unemployment peaked at around 17.2% in the second quarter of 2021 after we had the issues related to the national pauses and the lockdown. Unemployment last quarter was down to 7.2%. So that was a 10-year low of unemployment. that is in large part because our government, to be honest, has not only made sure that people were safe during COVID. You would know, even before the virus arrived, we made investments in stockpiling pharmaceuticals, building up Harrison's Point, making sure that once the vaccines became available, that we were able to stockpile vaccines. But on top of that, Dr. Kevin Greenidge, the governor of the central bank, he would have spoken to the implementation of what are called counter-cyclical measures, where in a time when the economy is strained, where your tourism revenues are down, when your VAT revenues are down, your corporate tax, personal tax, land tax revenues were all tanked out during COVID, what do? You stimulate the economy by putting money back in, which is why we saw the redevelopment of the Fairchild Street bus stand, the Constitution River project, the drainage project in Speightstown. All of these were investments that were made during COVID at a time when money wasn't coming in. The government actually was pumping money back in to get people going again, to get the economy turning again. So that is a big part of the reason why we were able to weather it, bring the economy back on track. And we understand why the economy ended up there, because as Dr. Monroe Knight would have pointed out, $1 billion in expenditure went out at a time when nothing was coming in. The first quarter of 2021, when we had the national pause, tourism receipts were down 89%. And that wasn't wholly due to our policies. It was because everywhere globally had closed their doors and had to shift policies. And at that time, we didn't have the vaccine as yet. So it became necessary to reduce and to restrict movement, but it became necessary to do that because of where the pandemic had left us. I also wanted to speak briefly to the fact that the world is already preparing for the next pandemic. So the WHO has named a theoretical, hypothetical disease called Disease X. Disease X is based on a potential novel pathogen that we don't yet know about that is supposed to be the next great pandemic. And with the understanding that the WHO is already saying, I actually found a study that reflected on 400 years worth of public health epidemics. Public health epidemics have been gradually increasing in frequency. So we're more likely now to experience another great pandemic than we would have been 10 or 20 years ago. So COVID is still among us. It's no longer a global pandemic issue. It's endemic now. But we are required to get in position for the next one, unfortunately. So I just wanted to briefly respond to some of the claims about the economy. I feel like I wasn't hearing enough about the efforts that were being made to get the economy back on track and what actually kept us afloat during COVID, and the fact that indeed we are seeing, last year we had 10% growth. The central bank report that came out today saying for the first quarter of the year, the first half of last year, we had 4.4% on top of the 10% that was in place from before. So I think that we're on the right track, and a measure like this would help us to be able to reallocate our resources in a way that we wouldn't have to tap into vital resources that will be supporting health, education, infrastructure to respond to a crisis situation. The Minister of Housing would have indicated that in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma, that $120 million went into rebuilding or repairing 1,700 plus homes. Now, in a situation like that, it makes a lot more sense to preempt it's better to have a roof better secure before than to wait for the roof to blow off and to replace it. And that's why we were here September in 2022 doing amendments to the Catastrophe Fund Act, because that would allow us to better prepare for a major crisis and to mitigate against loss, because I think the cost of repairing and replacing far exceeds the cost of building adaptation and resilience into our structures. So with that brief submission, Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Drake. Senator King. Senator Dr. Haynes. Again, the crystals.
Thank you.
Again, the crystals cross. Senator King.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I was not planning to speak, but I want to thank Dr. Senator Drakes. Because if I don't, I believe that my ancestors would not look at me kindly. But it's interesting that you made the point about the world we live in. And oftentimes, I get pretty much annoyed when our people, black people, have, I should say, short memories and also want to forget how we got here. We didn't get here where we are, where we have to be constantly borrowing money for development on our own initiatives. You cannot speak on these types of issues without looking at the history of where we came from. Mrs. President, we are, as Bob Marley and Peter Tosh and others have sung in songs, 400 to 500 years behind the West. The same West that, if I may use Barbadian parlance in this chamber, rake out the belly out of all of the places that they're colonized, left you with nothing to develop yourself with, and then said, here you are on your own, make it happen. Whereas the same resources that they took from you, they put into their own development, from the sciences, to agriculture, to the Industrial Revolution, to all of these things. How can we now pretend that we can compete on a global scale with the West that creates all of the things that we use? The economic systems, the education, everything. Think about it. You have been told throughout history that your creative minds are useless. You have bought into it, and therefore your educational system for years reflects that, where you place a lot of emphasis on being able to take in information and regurgitate it at an appropriate time. Whereas your creative people, the same people that you would like to be scientists and others, you stifle. And then you ask yourself, why am I in this predicament? We gotta get serious. Because we're not going to get out of it if we continue on the same trajectory from one generation to the next. This is what we've been fighting. That is why the measures to defer, and I always talk about this. I said it when it was the entertainer, I sang about it. IADB, IMF, all one big family. Same people, same thing. The problem that we have had for many, many years is that nobody was bold enough to open their mouth to say that this is a problem. It took the Honorable Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, to be bold enough, and also those persons who worked on the Bridgetown Initiative, to be bold enough to put the case for small island states who have to deal with hurricanes and all of these type of disasters, for the rest of the world to at least pay some attention to us for the very first time. For the very first time in my near 60 years, for the very first time. So we can't come to this chamber and decide that, oh, we got to keep borrowing money, how we going to pay it back, and without realizing that we've been in this position since, as you old people say, Adam was a lad. We've always been in this position, and we will always be in this position until we reach the stage where we are the ones doing the science, we are the ones creating our own medicines, we are the ones finding the new minerals, be they on land or under the ocean, but we are not doing that. So we always have to be playing catch up. When you spoke about the whole idea of things in terms of capitalism, we got people that leave the Caribbean and go up to London to witness University of Economics. Exactly, and come back home bragging and boasting about all the things that they have. But ask yourself, which West Indian person or black person who has had enough gumption to say, you know what, you see this system don't work for us. We're not dealing with that. We have to create our own, not one. There's no one. And so therefore, we can only do what we can do within the parameters within which we operate. This is, and I'm speaking generally for the average people out there like myself to understand. So that when others come with a lot of highfalutin words and things, you've got to look at your own situation and get serious about it. The point was made earlier about the lending agencies. And I smiled because, you know, the first thing I wrote on my paper here was, when I was at school, I had to do Shakespeare, The Merchant of Venice, Shylock. We've been dealing with Shylock all our lives, the real Shylock. Not imaginary one, real one. And so it is important that we, as I said before, we begin to get serious about these conversations that we're having. Because we have enough brains within the region, within the continent, to interact with each other, to begin to deal with these problems ourselves. But if you don't have financing to put into, let's say, the development of other renewable things that people come up with. And if you look across the globe, you can see people in Africa and other parts of the world coming up with all sorts of new ideas and technologies, but they don't have the financing to bring these things to market. And obviously, people who are benefiting as the world is today are not going to give them the prerequisite finances to bring these things to market, to cut them out. Because as you said, Dr. Drakes, we live in a capitalist society created by the best. And we are trying to do what? Our best. Underneath it all, I'm a Calypsonian, just remember. So it is important, Mr. President, that when we talk about these measures that the government is undertaking at this particular point in time, I want to take people back on a more serious note to the period when we had the pandemic, the ashfall. It was also the Sahara dust. And for those people who live in the east of this island, who even today have to deal with that dust, it is sometimes unbearable. Now, these are natural things that are happening, and as I always hear people say, oh, there's climate change and there's this thing, but the same scientists have told us that at one stage there was an ice age. So therefore, we can see this as part of a natural transition of the earth itself. How do we mitigate against it? We can do as much as we can at the small states, and we all know that we don't contribute. Our contribution to the whole emissions and stuff is negligible. But we have to pay the price of the same people who are making the rules and regulations as to what you should do and how you should do it and whatever else. And we are not the ones causing the problems. We all bear the brunt of it. This is the world that we live in. The question for all of us should be, when we have to take measures like this, is how are we going to play our own individual parts in dealing with this crisis? What is it that we can do to help ourselves under the circumstances? Food security is one of those things that I keep harping about, and I will continue to harp about it until I can't harp no more. Because it starts with you being able to eat, to survive, to have good health, and these types of things. And so, if you have to take monies, as we've seen during the pandemic, get all sorts from the vaccines to the building of North Point, to getting all sorts of other things to help persons who are out of work. I mean, when you think about what this administration did during that period, anyone who will be truthful would say that the job was more than commendable. I mean, up until recently, you still had persons working on housing for people who lost things during the freak storm. All of those are things that call for capital, call for money. And the government had to do what I call magic to make these things happen. And you have to borrow too, because you've been left high and dry since slavery and independence. You have no other way to get it. You know, so I watch on and I smile sometimes, because I think we like to have convenience memories when it suits us at a particular point in time. And oftentimes, true politicians and things don't like to say things that might offend other politicians in other parts of the world. Fortunately for me, I do not have that problem. Because at the end of the day, I have children, family, friends, and other people who look like me that I have to represent, regardless if I'm in here or outside on a stage. And I take it very seriously, because at the end of the day, the only persons that we really have to depend on is each other in this 166 square miles. And we are outside of the island chain, and God forbid that if anything real serious has to happen to us, it can take a long time for others to get to our aid. And so the time must come, or I would rather say the time has come, where we must, at some point in time, begin to agree on certain things that are for the benefit of every single person living in our place. And Mr. President, with those very few words, which I hope that persons listening to us and people at home will understand where I'm coming from, I am obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator John King. Her Honor, Senator Thompson.
Thank you. We are, Mr. President, at the beginning of a year. I'm just trying to get statistic. I apologize. We're at the beginning of the year, and I therefore want to take this opportunity to wish all colleagues a very happy new year. We are perhaps starting today on a very interesting note in terms of the speeches that have been made. Sorry, I really just wanted to get that figure. So I want to sort of speak to and respond to some of the comments that were made today, and I start with a very interesting conversation of Senator Dr. Drakes. So we're all prophesying today. I start with a very interesting conversation by Senator Dr. Drakes about fossil fuels and their likely replacement, and the fact that for the foreseeable future, we are going to be stuck with them. When one looks at the sales of the investment, new investment in fossil fuels versus green fuels versus renewable energies, the investment in renewable energies is outstripping that of fossil fuel, despite the increases in coal usage, coal sales, and coal production. And we did see some bump in fossil fuel sales post-COVID because there was some degree of panic in the global economy about renewables and the life of renewables and so on. But the reality is that green energy investment is outstripping fossil fuel energy investment, one. The next thing is that the transition from fossil fuels to renewables is taking place globally at a far more rapid rate than had previously been invested. I do not know what the two industries will produce and how long it will take for renewables to outstrip fossil fuels. But based on historical experience, I want to share something with you. And it just struck me as the senator was speaking. The first commercial motor car was sold in 1895. It was produced by a man called Alexander Winton, who built it in his basement and sold it for what was then the princely sum of $1,000. He was widely laughed at. The kinds of comments that were made was that this strange contraption had no future. That he was playing or fiddling with, he was playing the fool or fiddling with a buggy that won't need to be hitched to a horse, and that cars would never replace horses. His banker personally called him to tell him how very disappointed he was that he was wasting time, intellect, money, and energy on this nuisance contraption, this nuisance piece of equipment that would keep a lot of noise, cause pollution and problems, and that nobody wanted. At that time, of course, horses, carriages, buggies, and various forms of horse-borne and mule-borne and animal-borne transportation and machinery was extremely well entrenched. The $1,000 US at the time would be $36,517.38 today. And that was the figure that I was trying to do the comparison for, just to, by way, I know some people in the chamber have an interest in numbers and figures, and I just wanted to see what the inflation rate netted out at. Winton, against all the odds, persisted. And to use a very cliched impression, or I should make the point as well, but he persisted. And the rest, as they say, is history, to use a very cliched expression. What is interesting, and the comparison that I really want to make, is that at the time, motor cars were highly unreliable. His motor car and others in that early period, they broke down frequently, and once or twice a day you would be guaranteed to have a flat tire. We now have run flat tires where a car can be ripped and still run for many, many miles, as has happened to me, because I use run flat tires for safety and security. So we don't know what is going to happen with the technology. We are complaining today about battery storage and how unreliable it is. We are complaining about aspects of the green economy and the fact that they are not enabling transition quickly. But in time, perhaps we are on the cusp of another great economic transition, in the same way that we moved from the period of the animal transportation into the mechanized transportation of the Industrial Revolution, and now we are moving to a new era in technology and growth, that of the green technology with all its implications, which those of us sitting here with our limited imagination and understanding really cannot begin to see what the evolution would be, as indeed the banker did not see. And I found that particularly interesting, because it made me think that bankers, conservative as ever, often unhelpful when you have a new visionary idea, when you are seeking to be pioneering or to be entrepreneurial, your banker often does not give you the support that you so desperately need to commercialize your activity. So here we are, and perhaps seeing a mirror-type reflection of what transpired a long time ago. I was of the view that the Honorable Senator Drakes wanted to congratulate the government, but was so busy speaking about all the other things that she forgot to do so, and did not, in fact, record that in 2018, the debt to GDP ratio was 185%. It fell to 158 to 145, and despite the lack of revenue earning during COVID, despite the fact that you were not having tax at the same level, despite the fact that your foreign exchange earnings were reduced to nearly nil, the government was still able to manage its resources so well that it is today 115% and falling still. So we accept the intent to congratulate, even if not absolutely spoken. We do. Thank you so much. And you're welcome, because as the other senator doctor said, Senator Dr. Christina, she spoke to, in fact, to what the government was elected to do. So we are, in fact, attempting to do what we were elected to do. So, and in that regard, debt has moved, or debt repayment, from 67 cents in every dollar to 32 cents, which is a significant reduction, and it means that the burden being carried by the average Barbadian is substantially less. So when we talk about debt, we have to talk about it in context. We have to speak about it in terms of the new projects and activities and economic activity which is coming on stream to drive your foreign exchange earning, to drive your domestic activity, improve your domestic situation, create jobs, and ensure that your economy really is doing well, even in the context of externalities, or externalities which impact how you manage what you can give to the citizen, externalities, which people like to refer to as exogenous shocks. So I would wish, do not have the time today to speak to some of the very interesting matters raised by Senator Drake as she took a slow meandering approach, almost restful or inducing rest to matters, I struggle, to matters relating to the state of the global economy. But that is a discussion which, and it is regrettable that sometimes we are driven by what is on the order paper, because this is a matter that it would be good for us to engage on from a philosophical perspective and from a practical perspective. For me, always the question, I don't frame it as an economist, because even though I spent some time doing economics, you know, numbers are not my forte, and it's not how I see things. I see people. I see transformation in social conditions. I see people's lives being changed because the right policy intervention connected with them at the right time. And so for me, the question is, how do we frame development? It is a question that I've asked more than once. How do we frame development? Indeed, how do we define development? How do we ensure that development is sustainable? What really can a small island economy, a small island developing state, which is an open economy with a limited population that is aging, what package of benefits can we afford to give to our population? What are the common goods in that context? Who is entitled to what and how much? How do we carry a population? What suite of social services or social benefits can we afford as a society to give? And these are very, very critical questions as you discuss the issue of development in the social sector, sustainable economic development taken against a country with limited natural resources, where the constant exploitation of your natural resources jeopardizes their sustainability, impacts your social sustainability or your social stability, and then brings you into a sphere where you can or may see spurts of economic growth, but it is not sustainable. And I am not one of those people who supports jobless growth, because to me it is not about numbers, it is about people. And if we are going to improve the country, it isn't just that we are going to have an economy that is growing. You have to improve people's lives and people's quality of life. Now, the reality is that the nature of humankind is such that people can complain despite the fact that their circumstances are substantially improved. That is very much a reality. In fact, Alan Greenspan in, The Age of Turbulence, I think the book is called, makes the point, Alan Greenspan, sir, the former head of the Federal Reserve of the United States, the United States Central Bank, was for a very long time and was very, very highly regarded. I was going to go into the fact that the Fed is not a state-owned institution like our central bank, but is a private entity, and a lot of people don't know that. But the point is that Alan Greenspan wrote in his book, The Age of Turbulence, that a government can be at risk of transforming so much and so rapidly that the citizenry take it for granted and start to make demands that cannot be fulfilled, that are not sustainable, and then punish the government for the very excellent performance that it has given. And as a political class, a government always has to be considering how you balance these considerations. What can you give and to whom? What is the long-term cost? These are important questions when we seek to ask as a nation how we develop. And in fact, this whole question of debt really does impact your development trajectory. What monies, what disposable income is available to put into development activity and development and to ensure growth, to invest in the average citizen. In other words, can you have free healthcare, free education, a suite of social services or social goods, bus fare that is subsidized, water that is subsidized? What really can the country afford? And these are important questions when we seek to ask what is our long-term development trajectory, or put another way, what are our long-term development goals? Now, when I move from there then into the broader discussion that we had today on the issue of the legislation, the bill currently before the chamber, I want to make the point that this is a critical piece, an important piece of legislation. It is an important piece of legislative innovation. In fact, in our history, we have seen social engineering and environmental engineering done through policy and through legislative intervention. The Tenantries Freehold Purchase Act would be an example of that kind of intervention, of legislative intervention, which created development and growth in rural Barbados because it gave people access to land, which they could then use as capital in ways that people in Zimbabwe and South Africa and all over Africa and other countries in Europe are still fighting for today. Rights to land, rights to ownership of land, and there was no discrimination, and still exists all over the world, where many women do not have a right of access to the ownership of land and can only access land through men. So this is an important piece of social and environmental engineering, and it will redound to the benefit of the country. Looking at the legislation itself, and I want to reiterate, what the legislation seeks to do is to say that in situations where a country is in crisis, and that crisis is a natural disaster or a pandemic, and indeed it is now being projected that we are at risk globally of other types of pandemics, whether you talk about MR, the antimicrobial resistance, or whether you talk about the fact that the same way that COVID-19 seemed to come out of nowhere, whether engineered or naturally occurring, the reality is it can happen again. And since you cannot anticipate when it is going to happen, and that small countries as ours tend not to put down trust funds or don't have the resources to put down a little something for a rainy day, you then have to find other mechanisms of protecting the country and protecting the citizenry in the event of crisis. And this is what this legislation seeks to do. So it says, look, we know we have loans. In the event that we have a crisis, what is going to happen, or what will be agreed, is that payment of the loan, interest and principal would be suspended. It would be tacked on at the end of the loan. But for that 2 years or whatever the period is, we will be able to, instead of paying that loan every month, to divert that money towards a development activity, protection, repair, or resilience building. And what is resilience building? Resilience building, because it is one of these buzzwords that everybody uses now and people do not know what it is. Resilience building essentially is identifying risk, looking to see how you can reduce the extent of that risk or reduce the impact and consequences if the anticipated event takes place. So that what the government is doing here is saying, look, we, for the last year or so, have been having highly unusual weather. All during the summer, it rained. Every day now, it is raining. You wake up and it is raining very hard at a time when you would not normally be having these rains. We know what it is like to have had the ash fall. We know what it is like to have the freak storm. We know what it is like to have, praise God, only a Category 1 hurricane, Elsa. Can you imagine what a Category 2, 3, 4, or 5 would have done to Barbados? It's a rhetorical question. We do not wish to find out. So that the government then is seeking to say, in the event of such a crisis, we want to be able to suspend our debt payments. And at the end of the suspended period of suspension, 2 years or how much ever it is, we will then resume our payments again. And during that period, we immediately have access to funds to effect repair, to address the issue, to put into the domestic economy or into the domestic situation without immediately having to run to a financier and wait for a financier to say, well, give me a chance. I got to go to the board, and the board will meet him for another 3 months. Or, we don't really need all this kind of money for, show me the justify it for me. You know how it is when you go in the bank, justify it for me. Or, well, right now you're in our priority because they got a war in the Ukraine, and that's where we send them money, and things of that sort. Because banks too have their priorities, and it is true that a development institution may not be looking at the war in the Ukraine, but they may very well say that they do not have funding allocated for the repair of your bridge. That the fact that Turner's Hall Woods disappeared overnight is not their priority, and so on and so forth. So we have to be careful to find a way of financing our own domestic priorities in the event of crisis. And what happens in those situations? Now, there was a period when, coming straight out in the early post-colonial period, where when you considered what we were doing as independent nations, a lot of it was infrastructural building. Building out social goods, building up social services, building out your health care and your educational systems, because you were no longer seeking to produce a black underclass that was intended to form the bulk of the labor pool to do only blue-collar jobs and to work hard on plantations. You wanted to produce an educated population that could compete in the world, that could live with dignity, that were able to improve their circumstances and those of their families. So the government started to target particular areas of development. And then we have come to the period where it is now clear that development is integral, or rather, environmental considerations are integral to development and to social and economic sustainability. Ask fishermen, for instance, what sargassum has meant to fishing stocks and to their income, and what the migration of flying fish has caused for the society. The very fact that you now pay, I know, was it $5 for a flying fish? When I remember when flying fish used to be 10 cents, you know, and $1 each and so on. So it has, when you think about these environmental considerations, being esoteric, they really have to do with way of life, quality of life, and the cost of life, and the implications for the way certain sectors survive and do business. So people may think that we are coming here today to deal with a matter that has no practical application in the lives of the average citizen. But in fact, this matter goes to the very core of how we live, how we survive, how we do business. Dominica, as the Honorable Dr. Chantal Knight told us, lost 226% of GDP in a matter of hours and 95% of its housing stock. Nobody comes in to rescue you in those situations. You become the first rescuers. And if you do not have money in the banking system, if you don't have liquidity, if you are not in a position to say to your debtors, to your creditors, I am not paying you because I've had a natural disaster and I need to put my money into the people of the country and into building back our infrastructure, then to use a colloquial expression out of Trinidad, crapo smoke your pipe. So this is important. It is important too in the context of understanding that the building of infrastructural architecture, and I refer, when I use that expression, I mean things like sinking your cables underground so that they're not overhead and lost in high winds. I am talking about ensuring that your bridges, etc., are able to withstand certain wind speeds and with strengths. So the reality is that we are now building and have to build resilience to get tougher and to be able to withstand serious environmental disasters, and to be able to plan for them and build, engineer, and reconstruct with those considerations in mind. It is therefore important that this is being done in respect of two areas: the pandemic, potential pandemics, and potential natural disasters. And increasingly, natural disasters are, in fact, a very real risk for those of us who live in the Caribbean. The Caribbean and Latin America has been identified by World Bank IDB as the second most disaster-prone region in the world. And when you take out Latin America, if you put the Caribbean by itself, we are the most disaster-prone area in the world. So government is seeking to protect the country and the citizen against a risk that we know sooner or later will become a reality. And that is what makes what is happening today. Senator Drake's located her comments in the context of our energy options. We could speak, in fact, about our options in relation to water. We could speak in the context of our options for food and nutrition security. So when I speak to environmental infrastructure, it is the building and the protection of these particular areas to which I speak. Senator Dr. Monroe Knight also spoke to the issue of the Bridgetown Initiative and SDRs. As a small open economy, when Barbadians, we have to accept that we do not do business with ourselves. We do not trade with ourselves. We cannot engage only with ourselves. We have to have a relationship with the international space. And the more persuasive a voice you have on the international space, the more likely you are to be able to affect global change, and change which positively impacts your country and the average citizen. And so it is critical for the kind of advocacy that Barbados has been doing in the international space to continue, because we have already seen the shifts that are taking place in the policy of the multilateral banks, and the international financial institutions and across the multilateral system in how the vulnerabilities of SIDS are perceived, the extent to which grant capital versus loan capital is being realized, the extent to which rates for loans to vulnerable countries, the extent to which rates are being reduced, the fact that SDRs are increasingly being made available not to developed countries as those who took the bulk of it post-pandemic, but to people like us, and to the fact that the Bridgetown Initiative has been recognized, supported, and endorsed by a number of countries all over the world because they recognize that when they stand in solidarity with Barbados on the issues which the Bridgetown Initiative encompasses, that they in turn will get benefits. And I mean small countries in Asia, I mean across the CARICOM, I mean other SIDS, I mean LDCs, and countries in Africa. We are at this time entertaining the president of Senegal, warning a number of heads who has come to Barbados in recent times, a recognition that Barbados' star is rising in the global is in global ascendancy, and people want to be associated with the vision that our leader, our prime minister, is articulating, with the initiatives that Barbados is producing, which will benefit all developing countries, and particularly those with populations that look more like us. When you look at the legislation, as I started to do, you can see that the lenders or creditors will be made whole again, not just by tacking on the deferred payments to the end, but the fact that the legislation provides for CCRIF to certify that there has been an event of the nature which will trigger the relief, that there will be no more than 3 deferrals, so you can't keep saying, oh, there I had a problem. Kildare Chapman another time, you know, things rough. All right, so we had a hurricane 10 years ago now. I mean, we need another 5 years, which of course people would be inclined to do if it were open-ended. So there seeks to be some degree of certainty. The legislation brings some structure to the process. These are important considerations because while we are doing what will benefit us, at the same time, you know from experience with your commercial bank that you have to give your lender some degree of certainty in respect of your capacity to pay the terms and how it is all going to work out. So that, Mr. President, I am pleased to be able to support this piece of legislation, to say that Barbados has been one of the pioneer countries in these disaster relief clauses, now pandemic relief clauses, because it was the disaster relief clauses that were pioneered first, and the pandemic relief clauses is now new. And in fact, it was, you learn from your experience, and it was the experience of COVID with our $300 million, I think it was, in expenditure on COVID that taught you the lesson that in that situation, you will need also some degree of flexibility. Our levers of development can be regarded now as environmental and digital, because the old levers are changing. And it is important for Barbados to create its presence, to mark its presence, stamp its presence in these spaces. For small open economies, for small island developing state, the primary foreign exchange earner of which is still tourism, you always have to protect your space and your natural resources. You cannot develop without access to energy for your base population and for your visitors. You cannot develop without access to water and adequate potable water resources for your population and for your visitors and for all your new commercial entities. So that the environmental considerations which are going to become the platform on which our future development rests are critical to the country. And every time that new legislation is brought here or some new policy measure gives support or further resonance is not the word that I'm looking for, that gives support, I'll say that gives support to environmental considerations and environmental protections, the country ought to take note, not merely for taking note's sake, but in recognition that this involves every citizen, from the farmer to the fisher person, and I say fisher person because there are more women involved in the vending of fish than there are men. So from the farmer to the fisher person to the person sitting in the office who may or may not have access to proper air conditioning, who may or may not have access to water, etc. So these are important developmental matters that we were in fact dealing with. I hope that we will get the opportunity to have a broader discussion. Senator Drake spoke to the issue of coal and the fact that it is taken over, and I made the point that green energy is still in the ascendancy and getting larger investment. But on the matter of coal, there is something that happened there that is very interesting, and it should teach us as a small island developing state about marketing, languaging, and creating narratives and international perceptions about issues. We know that coal is one of the dirtiest fossil fuels, but somehow the US was able to plant this narrative of clean coal, which is now being repeated by people all over the globe. What is clean coal? It is the same dirty coal. You know, but it was very cleverly done. And in seeking how we create narratives and tell stories for ourselves that advance our interests, we too have to think about how we language our development prospects and our efforts to generate and protect our foreign exchange sources. There were one or 2 points that I wanted to make, but it has been a long day and I don't want to trespass on your generosity with time, Mr. President. So let me say to you that I hope that we will have the opportunity for a broad development discussion in this chamber and to look at this whole issue of the economy and debt and at the global level and what the implications are for Barbados. Because I made the point earlier, we do not exist in the world by ourselves. And often when you hear people on calling programs and speaking, you get the impression that, you know, we are disconnected from the rest of the world and that we are not impacted by what happens. So it is of critical importance for us to understand where the government is going on this matter and what the positive implications are for the country. And with that, sir, I'm much obliged and happy to support.
Thank you very much, Your Honour, Senator Thompson. Senator Dr. Morronay.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this is definitely one of the occasions where I must say that I want to thank all of the honourable senators who rose on their feet this afternoon to speak in relation to this bill. I particularly want to thank Senator Dr. Crystal Drakes, I'm prophesying, for taking the conversation perhaps in the place that it should be, outside of the realm of the national, and placing it within the context of how we are inserted into the global economy, and what that means for how we develop, what that means for how we are able to build resilience, what that means for our debt, and what that means for our people in the long term. It's an important discussion. And like Her Honor Senator Thompson, I think that it is one that is perhaps deserving of a broader discussion, and that we should look for another occasion, Mr. President, on which we can have that, because it's an important discussion to have. Again, like Senator Thompson, I think that people sometimes believe that these are esoteric things, that a nation, a country, can have fully control, can be in full control of what happens, because we see ourselves as sovereign nations. But we forget, like Senator King was saying, the history of how we have evolved and how that history still shapes our nation states and our insertion and interaction within the global economy. Certainly, at points within the discussion, I was reminiscing on the New World Group. I'm sure Dr. Christina Hines would remember. Somebody was asking Senator King about, when have people spoken to or spoken out about a different development trajectory? That discussion was happening for a long time within the region, within the intellectual community, and also as well the cultural community as well. The New World Group was not only a group of academics, but it brought together as well cultural artists, people who had a critical view about the development trajectory and were interested in framing a new architecture. So it is not a new discussion. I was lucky to call Norman Gervin a friend, Lloyd Bess a friend, Rex Snackleford as well. All of these men, giants, when we talk about alternative development, yes, and political economy for the region. Men with critical thinking. And again, I want to suggest that they are kernels of that within the region that perhaps we need to bring to the fore again, and it perhaps then places a responsibility on the University of the West Indies, the entire University of the West Indies, to make sure that we can have the resonance of that, of those critical voices and those critical thinkers, again, coming to the fore to lead that critical debate alongside governments. Because, Senator Drakes, a lot of what you talked about, and even your call for Development Commission, a committee to kind of look at how we go forward, a lot of that is also found within the Bridgestone Initiative. The Bridgestone Initiative is premised on the fundamental ethos that the international financial architecture is not fit for purpose, and that we must reform the debt architecture. And it calls for that fundamental reform. And Mr. President, much has been said, so I will not go on, but I think that we have framed the discussion sufficiently at the international context, but also at the national context as well. I want to thank Senator Haynes and also as well Senator Thompson for making sure that we understand that, as was said by Dr. Hines, that yes, we have to give careful stewardship, to call it prudent management of the economy, and that is important. And the government has been doing that. I believe, as we would have noted, the governor of the central bank did have his press conference today and did indicate that all of the metrics, Dr. Haynes, Dr. Drakes, suggest to us that the economy is doing well, that it is growing, that yes, financing and debt financing was high, but it was also met as well by policy-based loans, as well as by the BOSS bonds. We noted as well the decline in the GDP ratio as well, that was indicated, to 115%.
I believe you mean, for the record, debt to GDP ratio.
Sorry, debt to GDP ratio,
Yes.
sorry, debt to GDP
As
ratio.
opposed to
Thank
decline
you.
in GDP. Yeah, sure.
Thank you, debt to GDP ratio. We noted that the financial system remains stable and healthy. Financial institutions are well capitalized, liquidity is high and remains above statutory requirements. Mr. President, And while I haven't had time to read the full report, we know that we have an economy in the context of this government that is exercising prudent management. But also as well, I want to say that I always get very scared when we talk about that notion of prudent management of the economy and growth, because that's also laden as well politically, right? I was part of a movement when governments used to talk and development agents used to talk about good governance and what that means. And good governance and prudent management always meant, according to their metrics, it always meant tax reforms. It always talked about how we should manage the economy according to their own metrics as well. But I think, as was said, we're not only focused just on the growth metrics, but as well ensuring that we have the level of social development, that people can see themselves as part of the growth. Because this government, certainly, for this government, the priority and the priority of the Prime Minister that she always says to us is that we must see and feel people. See and feel people. That if we do not take care of the fundamental interests of those, then as a government, we would not have fulfilled our mandate. Mr. President, the last thing I would want to say, as well, like I said, much has been said, is that all of the discussion here points to why we need to continue the global advocacy as we're doing in the context of the British Young Initiative, but also as well in things like the climate change negotiations, the loss and damage fund, which we had to fight for continually. And only last year, at the end of last year, right down to the end, we're able to get a win. And I would want to say, Mr. President, for the record, that Barbados was very much at the forefront of that, with Avinash Prasad, Professor Avinash Prasad, leading the fight on the behalf of small island developing states and sitting as one of the critical negotiators as well within that context. So we are leading, we are innovating as well in terms of our policy solutions. And yes, Dr. Crystal Drakes, the energy transition is difficult, but it is one that we must contend with. It is one that we must contend with, is one that we must hold others to account for as well. But it's one, Senator King, that we must bring the population along in terms of them understanding their own role and responsibility within the fight. Mr. President, with those few words, I beg that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Munro Knight. The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honour do not leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that they do not leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Madam Chair, I beg that Clause 1 be amended to read the Debt, Natural Disaster and Pandemic Deferment of Payment Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2024. Sorry, pardon? Oh, slow? The Debt, Natural Disaster and Pandemic Deferment of Payment Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2024.
Honorable Senators will recall that this bill would have been on the order paper in 2023, and therefore an amendment is being sought to the title. The question, therefore, is that the bill be amended to read, the title to read, "The Debt, Natural Disasters and Pandemic Deferment of Payments, Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2024 instead of 2023. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Clause 2.
Madam Chair, I beg that Clause 2 stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, would you say no? The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg that the schedule be the schedule to the bill.
The question. Senator Dr. Christina Hines.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have noticed some errors in the schedule. There is a particular paragraph. It is on page 7. So this is, it's on page 7. And you will see at 9, the second paragraph is identical to the paragraph before it. And that is repeated. And also the third, I have a note on the third paragraph. On page 8, there is an incorrect word that will affect the meaning of that, that paragraph. It's the word maybe, M-A-Y-B-E, as opposed to may, space B. So those are two things. And this is repeated throughout all of, so it's also evident on page 9, 15, on page 9, that is fine, but I am making it, I'm raising it here because this was sent and somebody didn't see it. So in the event that, exactly, in case it is not seen, I'm raising the fact that this error occurs, duplicated paragraph, and this word that changes the meaning, because maybe is different from may be. This is also repeated on page 15 at 9 in the same way, page 22, 9 in the same way, page 31, 9 in the same way. And that paragraph that is repeated twice, please. Yeah.
I thank the honorable senator for drawing this to the attention of the chamber. Interesting on the may be and maybe. I guess that we'll soon start seeing YOU apostrophe RE for your. That's absolutely next. Perhaps not the moment to make that observation, but. So the question is.
Madam Chairman, is that what you want? Madam Chairman, just for the record, the observations of Dr. Hines, I wish to go on record to say, I think it's now beyond ridiculous, the level of drafting that is going on right now. It is nothing short of sloppy. And the challenge is, when we all make fun and say refer it to law review, and it doesn't get dealt with by law review, we have a whole cadre of legislation with these types of errors in them, whereby then we are left to depend on judges to have to try to figure out what was the intention of Parliament. It really isn't good enough because the level of errors that are coming through to this chamber are so basic and so puerile and so, what's the word I'm looking for? Ridiculous. Okay, so not puerile? Okay, that's just my opinion. Okay, ridiculous, because we don't even get a chance to have an issue with content anymore. We are now having to speak on grammar, typos, formatting, numbering. It is absolutely ridiculous. And I say all the time, I don't understand how come it's coming to us from the other place. But truth be told, neither chamber should be dealing with legislation at this level. It is abhorrent, and it is not fair to those of us who practice law and have to refer to legislation. We have Dr. Christina Hines telling us may and be. Seriously? It is sloppy, and it's unprofessional, and it is not good enough. We are the seat of government. We are governance. We can't have to deal with this when we have to deal with the content. The maritime bill that we did this morning was how many pages? 200 and something pages, and that's swept through Parliament, both houses. God only knows how many errors it contains. But you know when it will happen? When certain firms work for certain clients and make certain points of law that have to be addressed because the legislation is being drafted badly. I don't know where the problem is. I don't know if people are not getting enough time, but it needs to be dealt with. And it needs to be dealt with urgently, because we have a situation where people are going into court, arguing points, and then hearing, well, that's not the legislation. We've appealed, we've repealed, we've replaced, we've amended. And gone are the days when you can get an amendment in the consolidated index, because they're happening so fast and furious, there's no time to document. So sometimes people have to call here to find out what's going on with amendments, which is not fair to the law, to the clerks. It has to stop. It is not good enough. It is now bordering on offensive, at least to me. And it's embarrassing. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Tate. I cannot provide the answer, and I don't think that there will be an answer this evening. But in looking at the issue, generally, I'm inclined to wonder whether or not the problem resides in the fact that we have stopped teaching grammar in schools. And that, no, I say this with all seriousness, that people genuinely do not know the difference between M-A-Y space B and maybe. They don't distinguish any difference. That frequently, people do not know the difference between Y-O-U-R and Y-O-U''-R-E. And I could give a whole list of what are now basic grammatical errors that one sees even in documents at the highest level. I mean, I worked in the UN system. I was sometimes appalled at what I saw in final documents. In that case, it was often because you had documents being drafted by people who were not native English speakers, and therefore they had challenges in picking up the nuancing, the subtleties, the spelling and so on. But here, we have to concede, and part of the challenge is that maybe at the university level, as long as your content is right, nobody bothers with bad spelling anymore. So they are never corrected at any stage of their education. And when you attempt to correct people, they think that you are nitpicking, that you are difficult. In fact, in some cases, if you try to tell them there's a difference between may be and maybe, they just think that you're an idiot. It's the same word. So really, the problem may not be, or it might be, a change in the way we have approached education, grammar, and writing. And in fact, it may be necessary, given those trends and the fact that people are not taught grammar specifically, and that even at the university level, they now correct content or substance rather than spelling and presentation, that persons who are going into drafting classes and drafting programs should have at least 6 months training in grammar. use of social media where you do not have to be grammatically correct, the use of emails and WhatsApps also exacerbates the problem because all kinds of inaccuracies pass and people then hear, you good? And you give a thumbs up and move on. So I won't say that the question is, do we give a thumbs up and move on? But the question is, Senator Dr. Christina Hines.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I just wanted to verify that those observations are going to be sent to the appropriate entity to be corrected. So there will be? Right, so it's not just the maybe, which is, yes, grammar, but the other thing is a repeated paragraph. The entire paragraph is the same as the paragraph before. So it's fine to talk about grammar, but this is not just grammar. This is something else. Thanks.
I'm sorry, we're done, I know, but Madam Chairman,
Senator Tate.
the thing is, right, everybody could be exasperated, but this is dangerous when we are here passing legislation that by virtue of not being able to pick up everything that is either repeated or that is incorrectly drafted, we can be agreeing to things that ought not to be agreed to. It is dangerous. It needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. Whatever the problem, it needs to be addressed because that's what we're doing. And when we bring 200-page documents that we can possibly have time to review, because we're not only having to review content, we have to review grammar, which is also time-consuming. That's not our role. But it is our role because we know it's happening. So it's not right. It needs to be addressed. It has been happening. I've seen it every time. Since I've been here in 2018, that has been my cry. And as a lawyer, I cannot say yes to documentation that has such bad errors. It needs to be addressed. It is now a cry of urgency. Thank you, ma'am.
The chair acknowledges the comments made by honorable senators and can hope that it goes to the appropriate authorities, not only for amendment in relation to this particular matter, but certainly generally with the amount of time that honorable senators have to review matters before the chamber, as well as the quality of the drafting that is presented to all of us. It is a matter now of some frequent complaint and is a matter for concern. I regret to have to say. But I equally hope that the university will hear of the concern of teaching and without noting grammar or spelling. So the question is that the schedule be the schedule to the bill. All honorable senators in favor, as amended, that the schedule as amended be the schedule to the bill. Senator Dr. Hines.
Oh, I got that. Madam Chair, I just had a question before we vote on this, which is, this legislation is already being amended, would this be a matter for consideration for amendment here? The legislation is already being amended. So, with the change of the title. So can we not amend this legislation right now by removing all of those unneeded paragraph and putting the space between may and be? Yes. But this is already being amended. The point I'm making is it is already being amended
Yeah.
in any case. So
Your point is taken, Senator Dr. Hines, and the amendments will be moved by Senator Dr. Chantal Monroe Knight. After discussion, we have resolved on a way forward. I will hear Senator Chantal Monroe.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the repetition at clause 9, wherever it appears, which reads, CCRIF means CCRIF SPC, formerly the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, or any successor thereof, with whom the government of Barbados has entered into the CCRIF policy, be deleted. Sorry, so this is 9, page 7, clause 9. But I'm also saying wherever it appears. Wherever it appears. Madam Chair, I do want to also note that while we can do amendments here, corrections, which would be like the one to the maybe, will then have to go to the Law Review Commission because that's a correction. We can do amendments, Madam Chair. So this is why I am moving the amendment in relation to the deletion of this repetition, because that is an amendment, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, let me, again, because I'm not sure that everybody was listening, so let me please, Madam Chair, through you, yeah? I beg to move that the schedule be amended to delete the repetition which states CCRIF means CCRIF SPC, formerly the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, or any successor thereof, with whom the government of Barbados has entered into the CCRIF policy, be deleted wherever the repetition appears.
So the question is that the commitment is that those matters, like the maybe, would go to the law revision for correction, as indeed all corrections have to go to law revision. Amendments can be made by the chamber, and therefore it is being proposed that we delete all repetitions, such as that which occurs at the schedule, paragraph 9, clause 9, page 7. CCRIF means CCRIF SPC, formerly the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, or any successor thereof, with whom the government of Barbados has entered into the CCRIF policy. So it is proposed that the duplication should be deleted, and that is an amendment versus correction. But while corrections are being done, the law revision may want to look at the appropriate use of whom and which. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I just have a question based on what you just said. So does it mean that we are passing legislation that needs correction to get it corrected by the law review to bring it back as an amended piece of legislation? That's what's happening?
The corrections have, if you're going to correct, you have to go to the lower house. If we're changing, it has to go back to the lower house.
Okay.
If the Senate, so essentially it is being returned, but where there are corrections, they do have to go to law revision.
That's what I'm asking, because currently it's in the bill. It's a bill. When we pass it, it becomes an act. Are we passing it or we're not passing it? Are we passing it before it gets to law review, or are we holding it and sending it? So I'm not talking about that, I'm talking about this talk about law review. Wait. Who's they that has that power?
Madam Chair, Madam Deputy Chair, that you can correct, go ahead.
No, and if I don't understand, I will keep asking until I understand, Senator Monroe Knight. If it was coming properly and if y'all had picked up the errors, corrections, and we want to have this conversation.
Heard you as,
I,
Madam Chair, can I be apprised as to where we are in the order of the House?
So I was just trying to make sure that as many members of the Senate as needed got clarity, even if not comfort. And I did already put the question. The question.
That report,
Yes.
Thank you
Yes,
very much.
please.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee as amended.
The question is that I now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee as amended. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill be read a third time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the bill do now pass and be cited as the Natural Disaster and Pandemic Deferment of Payment Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2024.
The question is that this bill do not pass as amended and be cited as the Natural Disaster and Pandemic Deferment of Payment Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2024. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Mr. President, that brings us to the end of government business for the day. I do now beg that the chamber be adjourned. Sorry, I'm trying to look for the date for next Wednesday. Is it the 7th? The 7th of February.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. The question is that the Honorable Senate be now adjourned until Wednesday, February the 7th, 2024 at 11 a.m. Will all honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The Senate is therefore adjourned until Wednesday, the 7th of February, 2024 at 11 a.m.